Today, the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi is a busy center of commerce, industry, and tourism. Modern versions of the old stern wheel riverboats tie up along its picturesque waterfront. In 1862, during the Civil War, the city was a major southern port on the Mississippi River. Vicksburg was called the Gibraltar of the Confederacy. Its courthouse, prominent on the skyline, identified it as the county seat. It was a strategic transportation hub for the young, struggling Confederacy. Federal forces waged a vast military and naval campaign that culminated in a siege and the capture of the city. Vicksburg National Military Park commemorates and interprets the climax of that crucial campaign. Early in the war, both North and South had realized the importance of the Mississippi River. Its source is in Minnesota, but the focus for wartime strategy was the nearly 1,000 miles from Cairo, Illinois, south to the Gulf of Mexico. The river separated Texas, Arkansas, and most of Louisiana from the rest of the Confederacy. The loss of the river to the Federals would mean the loss of supplies and recruits from the Trans-Mississippi region. It was essential for the South to prevent the North from gaining control of the Mississippi. The Confederates fortified strategic points along the river. One of the most important was Vicksburg. President Abraham Lincoln had long been aware of the city's enormous significance to both sides. He called Vicksburg the key and said the war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket. In the early summer of 1862, Union flag officer David Farragut, after capturing New Orleans, proceeded north on the river with his fleet of warships. The Confederate garrison at Vicksburg was not intimidated. Farragut bombarded the city, but ineffectively. It was clear that Federal land forces were needed here as well. One noteworthy Confederate boat on the river was the ironclad Arkansas, seen here under construction. She was called a ram, designed to ram and sink enemy vessels. On July 15, 1862, she neared Vicksburg, coming down the Yazoo River. Wholly on her own, she fought a running battle through parts of 3 Federal squadrons stationed above Vicksburg. It was a spectacularly daring feat. The gallant vessel escaped, but with heavy damage. A few months later, she had to be blown up to prevent capture by the Federals. Methodically, by late summer 1862, Union forces had eliminated all enemy river strongholds except Port Hudson, Louisiana, and Vicksburg, Mississippi. In October 1862, Federal General Ulysses S. Grant was ordered to the area following his major victories at Fort Donelson and Shiloh in Tennessee. His instructions were to destroy Southern resistance on the river. Confederate General John C. Pemberton, who had proved his administrative skill in previous service at Charleston, South Carolina, took command of about 60,000 widely scattered Southern troops in Mississippi and East Louisiana. His orders were to maintain Confederate control of the river. Among the Federal gunboats in the Vicksburg area was the USS Cairo. She was well-manned and well-gunned, and her superstructure was partially covered with thick iron plates. As part of the Union's inland navy, her career was undistinguished. However, she fought in the Battle of Memphis on June 6, 1862. This was her only real action. Battle was not to be her great claim to fame. In December of that year, she and other federal boats were assigned to clear mines, then called torpedoes, from the Yazoo River north of Vicksburg. A torpedo was a large container, often a demijohn, of powder, anchored to the river bottom and fired by electricity sent by wire from shore as an enemy vessel passed close to it. 2 underwater explosions blasted great holes in the boat's hull. The Caro sank in 12 minutes, miraculously with no lives lost. She was the first vessel in history to be sunk by an electrically detonated torpedo. Vicksburg stood on a large horseshoe bend of the river. Grant determined to dig a mile-long canal across the base of the peninsula opposite the city. This would allow him to get his troop transports past the city's batteries. He could then attack from the south. The canal was begun, but unusually high water forced the Federals to abandon the effort. Even today, its remains suggest the magnitude of the work. The site is protected as part of Vicksburg National Military Park. Additional projects were attempted to the north, but the trackless swamps and bayous formed a natural defense for the city. Grant never really expected success here. However, these efforts allowed his army to maintain the offensive, and the enemy was kept guessing. By the end of March 1863, Grant's army was no closer to Vicksburg than it had been 3 months earlier. He now decided on more aggressive tactics. He would abandon the morass in the north and again plan an attack on Vicksburg from a different direction. The south and the east were the only possible choices. In either case, his army would need transports, gunboats, and supply vessels to cross the Mississippi River below Vicksburg. But these vessels were north of the city, under the command of Admiral David Dixon Porter. On the night of April 16, 1863, the Federal fleet ran the gauntlet, exchanging thunderous fire with Confederate batteries on shore. It was one of the most awe-inspiring spectacles of the war. The damage to the boats was repaired, and they were soon available for Grant's next move. His men left their bivouac in Louisiana, northwest of Vicksburg, on the last day of April, and started a wide counterclockwise circuit around the city. Now that high water had begun to recede at the end of a wet winter, Grant was at last able to undertake the strategy he had preferred from the start, to attack Vicksburg from the east. On April 30th and May 1st, the Federals crossed the river unopposed to Bruinsburg, Mississippi. Here they established a secure, if muddy, foothold about 40 miles south of Vicksburg. The next day, near Port Gibson, the Federals overwhelmed a far smaller Confederate force. The latter fell back toward Vicksburg. Grant's men pushed deeper into enemy country, moving fast, occasionally foraging for food. On May 12th, there was a sharp clash at Raymond, where another small Confederate force was defeated. The Southerners retreated to Jackson, the state capital. General Joseph Johnston, Pemberton's immediate superior, had taken command of the Confederate forces at Jackson. He decided the city could not be held and evacuated it. On May 14th, the Federals attacked. For them, the token resistance was of less concern than the heavy rain. Jackson was taken easily, and the invaders destroyed supply facilities and railroads. They turned west, directly toward Vicksburg. It was 40 miles away. Halfway there, at Champion Hill on May 16th, Grant's army attacked and overwhelmed the Southern forces under General Pemberton himself. This was the bloodiest engagement of the Vicksburg campaign. Here, Confederate General Lloyd Tillman was killed while directing artillery fire. The instant of his death is depicted in one of the most dramatic statues in Vicksburg National Military Park. Grant resumed his westward march. He attacked the enemy at Big Black River Bridge the next day and forced them back across the river. Pemberton's men burned the bridges behind them and retreated into the fortifications of Vicksburg. The Federals built new bridges and surged across the river, moving closer yet to the city. General Grant's forces had won 4 battles in 5 days. This was one of the most outstandingly successful campaigns of the war. He moved relentlessly on, finally to the outskirts of Vicksburg itself. The Confederates had built an extensive defense line along a ridge that roughly followed the city's perimeter, but at some distance from it. There were strong forts at key points. The Federals gradually took up positions on a series of nearly parallel ridges, a few hundred yards or less away. To gain an unobstructed view, both sides cut down the woods. The Confederate defenders felled the trees with their tops pointing toward the Union approaches. Branches were interlaced and sharpened, forming almost impenetrable barriers called abattis, a defense device used in war for centuries. Grant was convinced his enemy's morale was broken by their resounding defeats of the past week. He resolved to attack Vicksburg at once. He did so on May 19th, only 2 days after his victory at Big Black River Bridge. Federal artillery shelled the enemy lines. In the northeast sector along the appropriately named Graveyard Road, the corps of General William Tecumseh Sherman, Grant's most trusted subordinate, struck at Stockade Redan. Against impossible odds, a color bearer from the 1st Battalion, 13th U.S. Infantry, actually planted a flag on the slopes of the fort. There was a desperate fight, and the Federals were cut to pieces. The units engaged suffered 43% casualties. But most of Grant's army was not in a sound position to attack and accomplished little. The Union efforts of May 19th were halted in the ditch outside the Redan, where the 13th Regiment had so distinguished itself. During the Civil War, the colors, national flag or unit flag, were the soul of the outfit. General Sherman later recognized the heroic service of the 13th Infantry. He authorized them to inscribe the phrase, "First at Vicksburg," on their battle flag. These proud words are the battalion's motto to this day. The first Federal attempt against Vicksburg had failed. It was hastily planned and poorly executed. Grant had gained nothing but the realization that his enemy was well entrenched and resolute. But he still felt a need for speed to prevent the arrival of Confederate reinforcements. Delay would also give the Southerners time to improve their defenses and bolster morale. After a more thorough reconnaissance, Grant ordered another, far larger assault for May 22nd. His second attack stretched along a vast 3.5-mile front from north of Vicksburg to the southeastern approaches, with concentrated assaults at 3 points. More artillery was brought up to give added covering fire to the infantry. By now, some Union troops were within 200 yards of the enemy. An intense 4-hour-long Federal bombardment began early on May 22nd. It ended abruptly at 10 a.m. This was the signal for the infantry to move forward. The attack on formidable Stockade Redan was made across open landscape under heavy Confederate fire. This fort had steep outside slopes surrounded by a ditch. It was here that Sherman had failed 3 days earlier. Company C, 8th Wisconsin Infantry, figured prominently in the action of the 22nd. This unit carried its mascot, Old Abe the War Eagle, into battle. He had accompanied his men in action before, often soaring above the fighting, and would do so until he was retired in 1864. regiment was delighted to hear that the Confederates called him the Yankee Buzzard. Fierce Federal assaults were also made at the Great Redoubt, the strongest fort in the Confederate line, located at its center and at the nearby 3rd Louisiana Redan. These forts guarded the Jackson Road, the main thoroughfare to the city in 1863. There was constant activity in this area, in both assaults and throughout the following siege. Grant established his command post nearby for the second attack. The Shirley House was the only building still standing here on May 22nd. In the fighting that raged around it, Mrs. Shirley, her 14-year-old son Quincy, and several slaves were trapped inside. Shells tore into the building. The terrified occupants showed a white cloth from the upper front porch, and Federal soldiers soon hurried them to safety in a ravine behind the house. In a road cut under the cover of smoke, the column of Union men approached the enemy line. The smoke lifted slowly, and the Federals suffered devastating casualties. Other Federal units were pinned down by artillery fire. On both sides, battlefield surgeries were bloody and often overwhelmed with wounded men. Modern standards of hygiene were unknown. Among the Confederates, great gulps of liquor were often the only available anesthetic. Arm and leg wounds from the large bullets in use at that time were frequently so serious that doctors had no choice but amputation. With the obvious failure at the center of the Union line, and with Sherman halted farther north, Grant was on the point of calling off the attack. To the south, at the railroad redoubt, troops under Federal General John McClernand smashed through a hole in the defenses and fought their way into the fort itself. His men also planted a flag on a smaller nearby fort, but failed to get inside. General McClernand was an extremely capable military man, but he was argumentative and was known to exaggerate his own accomplishments. He sent a courier to Grant, falsely reporting that he'd taken 2 forts and asking for reinforcements and a renewed Federal attack. Grant did not believe the news, but in support ordered another assault in the center and to the north. It too was repulsed. At the railroad redoubt, a Texas unit counterattacked and began a savage hand-to-hand fight with McClernand's Federals inside the fort. The general's small success was soon turned into a humbling withdrawal. Well before sundown on May 22nd, all Federal attacks had been bloodily repulsed. This second assault on Vicksburg was a total failure on a far more devastating scale than the first assault of May 19th. Union losses were high. The bitter controversy over the contentious General McClernand intensified, and within a month, General Edward Ord replaced him, by General Grant's order. After 2 costly attempts to take Vicksburg by storm, Grant realized that further direct assaults were useless. The Confederates could not be overcome by force. Rather than waste yet more lives, Grant began formal siege operations on May 26, 1863. Federal dead were still strewn on the field, some from the assault of May 19th. Bodies had bloated and turned black. One Confederate muttered, "The Yanks are trying to stink us out." White flags appeared on the southern line. The Federals hoped they meant surrender, but a note from General Pemberton simply begged, in the name of humanity, for Grant to bury his dead. The truce was approved for 2.5 hours. Union burial parties did their grisly work. Blue and gray mingled warily, and Southern tobacco was swapped for Northern coffee. The truce flags were taken down and everyone ran for cover. The siege then began in earnest. The siege of Vicksburg was a full military and naval blockade. The classic strategy of any siege is to starve the enemy into submission. The Federal Army slowly cut off all entrances to the city by land. On the river, Admiral Porter's fleet prevented access by water. Vicksburg was isolated. Neither food nor military supplies could be brought in, and reinforcement of the garrison was impossible. Illustrated newspapers in the North were fond of showing leisurely, often bored Federal soldiers during the siege of Vicksburg. The reality was far different. Grant kept his men busy. Federal fatigue parties dug zigzag trenches called saps. Because the saps never pointed directly toward enemy lines, the Confederates weren't able to shoot into them. After the Federals had zigzagged about 100 yards closer, they dug another trench parallel to the enemy and brought up infantry and artillery. Then the process was begun again. The purpose was to move as close as possible to the Confederates in order to attack and overwhelm them by sheer numbers of men. Tens of thousands of feet of trenches were dug during the siege. General Pemberton ordered a rigid conservation of powder. Among the Confederates, every shot had to count. The distance between the lines was always short, and the Federals found it necessary to dig shelters called shebangs in hillsides and trenches. This photograph, the most famous of the few that were made on the Vicksburg battlefield during the war, shows the Shirley House and Federal shebangs crowded nearby. Following Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of January 1, 1863, he called for black troops to be raised. Within 5 months, blacks wore Federal uniforms for the first time ever in action. On May 27th, they participated in a large-scale attack on Port Hudson, Louisiana, as part of the campaign to open the Mississippi River. Throughout the siege of Vicksburg, the Federals kept up an almost constant bombardment. From positions on land and from gunboats on the river, they pounded the Southerners. In the Confederate lines and in the city of Vicksburg, too, shelling was relentless, day and night. Early on, Grant discovered that all streams supplying Vicksburg with drinking water originated in or flowed through the Federal lines. He had mules and cattle slaughtered, and their rotting carcasses were thrown into the streams. The polluted water forced Vicksburg soldiers and civilians alike to turn to springs and the muddy Mississippi. Federals enjoyed good water in plenty, but well before the end of the siege, it was rationed for the Southerners, 1 cup per day. Confederate ranks were thinned radically by sickness, malaria, dysentery, and diarrhea, much of it caused by unfit drinking water. The Federals dug their way still closer to the enemy lines. This continuing operation provided a chance for yet another offensive tactic. Once they were close enough to the Confederates, they could tunnel under the enemy's lines, set off an explosive, blow them up, and surge through the breach. The most spectacular of these attempts was at Logan's Approach. The saps here were at least 7 feet deep and 8 feet wide, big enough for 4 men abreast in column, as well as wagons and artillery. Captain Andrew Hickenlooper was in charge of the project. Digging was begun on May 26th. The goal was the 3rd Louisiana Redan. The Confederates dug counter shafts and could hear their burrowing enemy, not only the digging but their conversation. However, sound travels oddly underground, and the location of the work couldn't be determined. The Federals reached the fort and hollowed out a room under it. On June 25th, the Federals stopped digging. The Confederates knew it, but they still had not found the tunnel. By kegs and bags, 2,200 pounds of black powder were carried to the tunnel and into the underground room. The blast was scheduled for 3 p.m. The fuse was lighted. 3 o'clock passed. Nothing happened. 3:15, 3:20. Something was wrong. Give it a little more time. Men, wagons, and earthworks were blown skyward. The Federals surged into the crater blasted out by the mine. A battle raged for 26 hours. It was hand-to-hand fighting with bayonets and clubbed muskets. Shells with lighted fuses were used as hand grenades. Bodies of the dead and wounded on both sides all but filled the crater. At last, the Federals realized their work had been in vain. The great effort had failed. Grant recalled his soldiers. A second mine was detonated here on July 1st, but it was not followed up by an infantry attack, and it accomplished little. Several men were blown into the air by the second explosion, including a slave named Abraham. He landed behind Union lines. He was asked how high he went. "Don't rightly know," he said. "I think 3 miles." The Federals made him an instant celebrity. Pemberton had hoped for a joint Confederate offensive with General Joseph Johnston, who had returned to Jackson. But Johnston believed he had too few men. On July 1st, when he had last sent a relief force toward Vicksburg, it was already too late to help. For civilians in Vicksburg, life was harrowing throughout the siege. Many people sought shelter from the constant bombardment by digging caves into the hillsides and hollowing out underground rooms. Some caves were supplied with meager furniture and utensils. Proud, desperate, and touching attempts to make a bearable existence under appalling conditions. Yet the city's life went on, sometimes in makeshift ways. The supply of newsprint was exhausted, and issues of one newspaper were printed on the back of wallpaper. Before the end, food as well as water was strictly rationed, and there was scarcely enough to live on. For civilians and soldiers alike, mule meat and pea bread were often all that was available. By the end of the siege, in approximate figures, 30,000 Confederate soldiers faced 70,000 Federals. The strength of the Confederate fortifications allowed the defenders to hold out for 47 increasingly terrible days. With fast dwindling supplies, with no possibility of relief, with a defending army so weakened by sickness and hunger that any counterattack on the enemy was unthinkable, General Pemberton offered to surrender to General Grant. It was July 3rd, 1863. At the first appearance of a white flag, Northern artillery fell silent. Federals and Confederates slowly stood up along the lines and faced each other without guns. Soon, Generals Grant and Pemberton met to negotiate under an oak tree between the lines. Grant demanded unconditional surrender. Pemberton refused. His men had been through too much. After a further exchange of messages, the federal demands were reduced and the terms of surrender were agreed upon. On the next morning, July 4th, Grant met Pemberton just inside the Confederate line. The long campaign, the dreadful privation and suffering had come to an end. The men in gray stacked their guns and their flags. The Confederate banner was taken down from the courthouse cupola. The Federals marched into the city. It was the 4th of July, a day of celebration in the North. The men in blue saluted the vigorous leader who had brought them to this hard-won victory. 5 days later, Port Hudson also surrendered, and the entire Mississippi River was in federal control. The Confederacy was cut in two, and the Union possessed a broad highway into the heart of the South. There was great rejoicing in New Orleans at the arrival of the first commercial steamboat that traversed the river without enemy interference. President Lincoln was proud of his men at Vicksburg. Pride shows in his majestic words, "The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea." Today, Vicksburg National Military Park extends from the river north of Vicksburg along a broad arc to the city's southeastern flank. It includes restored earthen forts, rifle pits, and artillery positions, both Federal and Confederate. The park came into being largely through the efforts of William T. Rigby in the center, who had been a Federal infantry lieutenant here. He and other veterans, both Union and Confederate, petitioned Congress, and the park was established in 1899. At the Visitor Center, orientation programs and exhibits are presented. There's an information desk and a fine bookstore, as well as an excellent museum. The park tour route starts at the Visitor Center and follows a 16-mile loop road, most of it one way. It passes under Memorial Arch, dedicated in 1920 following a huge reunion of veterans of the Vicksburg siege and defense. There are over 1,300 statues, monuments, and markers. Federal positions and actions are signed with blue markers, Confederate with red. The battlefield is composed essentially of the outer Federal siege line and, on a parallel ridge, the inner Confederate line of defense. The northbound half of the road follows the Federal line. Therefore, northern memorials and markers are seen first. The southbound half follows the Confederate line, where monuments from the southern states are located. The two lines are seldom more than a few hundred yards apart. By the time of the siege, most of the trees had been cut down, but much of the field is forested now, as it was before the Civil War. In the early 1900s, when the first markers and monuments were being put in place, the landscape still closely resembled its appearance during the war. The present forest is mainly the result of efforts in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps to halt erosion. Since then, the National Park Service has been able to maintain only the most significant areas of the battlefield and the topographical features that made Vicksburg the natural fortress it was. On the Michigan Memorial, the figure carries a laurel branch of victory for her troops. She represents the spirit of the state. A great deal of symbolism is used in many monuments throughout the park. Battery de Gaulier is the first of 15 principal points of interest on the tour, and it's the largest display of Civil War cannon in the park. This was a powerful Federal artillery position. There was heavy activity here throughout the entire siege. The Union guns here at Battery de Gaulier hammered away at the Great Redoubt, largest fort on the Confederate defense lines. It towers above this position 800 yards away. The Shirley House is the only remaining wartime structure in the park. Fighting raged around it in 1863, and it was so badly damaged that it was uninhabitable. The Shirleys moved into the city, and eventually the building was abandoned. It was bought in 1902 for inclusion in the park. Today, only the exterior has been restored to its appearance prior to the battle. This area served as the headquarters of an Illinois infantry regiment, and the Illinois Memorial stands nearby. It's designed after the Pantheon in Rome and is about 1/4 its size. 47 broad steps rise to the graceful colonnade, symbolizing the 47 days of the siege of Vicksburg. Following the specific instructions of the state commission that oversaw its construction, no device of war is depicted on the memorial. Inside, the great dome is open to the sky, as in the Roman original. Illinois supplied one-half of Grant's men at Vicksburg, and bronze tablets on the walls list the names of over 36,000 participants. It's entirely fitting that this is the largest and most impressive monument in the park. Illinois also claims Lincoln and Grant as its sons, both of whom were born elsewhere but became residents of the state. One of the most astonishing personal stories of the war is hidden here behind the name of an infantry private. Albert D.J. Cashier has a solid combat record for 3 years until the war's end. He's at the right in this wartime photo, a slightly built soldier. 46 years later, after an injury, a doctor discovered his incredible secret. Albert Cashier was actually a woman. She died in 1915. Her gravestone reveals that she was Jenny Hodges, born in Ireland. She was also Albert D.J. Cashier, Company G, 95th Illinois Infantry, in the Civil War. Both the 3rd Louisiana Redan and the Great Redoubt above it protected the Jackson Road. Although this historic road is no longer in use, portions of it may still be seen in the park. The grass belies the fact that this was a busy route into Vicksburg in wartime. The 122-foot-tall Wisconsin Memorial is topped by a large statue of Old Abe, famous mascot of the 8th Wisconsin Infantry. His war service and that of all of the sons of the Badger State are commemorated by this dramatic granite column. Albert Cashier fought with Illinois men in the ravine at the right. It was and is the responsibility of the individual states to put up memorials, honoring their own soldiers and units. This is true at all Civil War areas administered by the National Park Service. Men from 28 states fought in the Vicksburg campaign. The Kansas Memorial symbolizes the entire Civil War era. The complete lower circle represents the pre-war nation. The middle broken circle is the country divided by war. At the top, a second perfect circle shows the Union restored. There's a cluster of memorials from 5 northern states in the area where General Grant's headquarters was located. Men from these states manned the exterior federal line north and east of the city. The Massachusetts Memorial was the first state monument to be erected at Vicksburg National Military Park. When the 15-ton granite boulder that forms its base was hauled through the city in 1903, crowds lined the streets to watch. The dedication was a major event in the park's early history. The statue is of a typical young soldier marching into battle, very likely with a prayer on his lips. The Pennsylvania Memorial nearby bears an inscription suitable for any state monument in the park. Here, brothers fought for their principles. Here, heroes died for their country. And a united people will forever cherish the precious legacy of their noble manhood. A heroic statue of General Ulysses S. Grant stands on the site of his headquarters. Midway on the westbound stretch of Union Avenue is Thayer's Approach. During the afternoon of the May 22nd attack, Federals charged up this slope toward the enemy, who were dug in at the top. The assault was stopped. Later, the Federals began an approach trench up the 200-foot-high hill. To avoid having to go over the exposed ridge where the present Tour Road crosses, General Thayer's men dug a tunnel through it for safer access to their works. High on a bluff above the river stands the imposing United States Navy Memorial. At 202 feet in height, this is the tallest monument in the park. It's a tribute to the Federal Navy's diligent efforts to reopen the Mississippi River. Not far away is another Navy memorial, Battery Selfridge. This marks an installation entirely of naval guns, removed from a federal gunboat and mounted on this high ridge. They were the only land-based artillery manned by naval gunners during the siege. The battery is named for Lieutenant Commander Thomas O. Selfridge, Jr., who was in command of the USS Carow when she was sunk in the Yazoo River. Near the foot of the bluff, almost at river level, is the ironclad Carow herself and the adjacent museum. The boat's modest wartime exploits and even her unusual sinking are far less significant than her later story. The saga of her salvage recorded on old movie film and the inestimable historic value of the artifact she contained give the tough little boat a secure place in history. When the Carow was sunk in December 1862, she went down in about 36 feet of muddy water. In the late 1950s, nearly a century afterwards, researchers located her remains and divers confirmed the finding. The Carow had gone to the bottom so quickly that there was little time to save anything. In 1960, her pilot house was brought to the surface, remarkably well preserved. Many small relics were recovered, and the boat, her fittings, and armament seemed virtually intact. It was decided to attempt to raise the Carow. This turned out to be a mammoth engineering feat. The remains were fragile and buried in mud and debris. The skills of many specialists were needed. Even an Army ordnance team was called in to handle some live ammunition found sealed in a magazine, still completely dry. The boat's remains were carried by barge to a shipyard downriver. Her parts were painstakingly cleaned. She was a virtual three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle to reconstruct. After exhaustive research, the restoration of the Carow was completed in 1984, and she was put on exhibit the next year at Vicksburg National Military Park. The holes blown in her hull by the torpedoes are easily spotted. Her guns are in place, and so is her great paddle wheel, inboard for protection. All are the originals. In the adjoining museum, many of the intriguing artifacts found on board the Carow are on display. The men's personal articles are particularly interesting, along with items from the crew's mess. The USS Carow and her priceless contents form one of the most important Civil War exhibits in the country. Many Confederate soldiers who died at the siege of Vicksburg are buried in the city cemetery. Vicksburg National Cemetery, however, is now part of the military park. It was established in 1866 so the remains of Federal soldiers could be removed from temporary field burials throughout the area and reinterred here. Nearly 17,000 Union men are buried on this site. 13,000 are unknown. Most upright stones mark the graves of identified soldiers. Square blocks, the graves of the unknown. On fame's eternal camping ground, their silent tents are spread. But glory guards with solemn round the bivouac of the dead. The park road from the cemetery south to the visitor center follows the Confederate defense line. Memorials put up by the southern states are located here. Fort Hill anchored the northern end of the Confederate line firmly on the river. This was so formidable a stronghold, and its flanks were so steep that no Federal attack was ever made against it. The water below is no longer the Mississippi River, which changed course in 1876 and left Vicksburg high and dry. What you see today is a diversion canal, bringing the waters of the Yazoo River into the old bed of the Mississippi. Confederate General Martin Greene, a brave soldier, was warned not to expose himself to enemy fire. "Nonsense," he scoffed. "The bullet meant for me has yet to be molded." He was instantly killed by a Federal sharpshooter. Missouri was divided in her loyalty during the war. She was represented in the Vicksburg campaign by 27 units in the Federal Army and 15 in the Confederate. Her memorial is unique in that it's dedicated to men on both sides. The bronze relief at the left depicts Missouri Federals attacking this position. That on the right, Missouri Confederates defending it. Many of these men were even recruited from the same county. The Civil War's heartbreaking theme that brother fought brother is more poignant here than at any other site in the park. The Arkansas Memorial shows twin pylons representing North and South as the country is cut in two by the sword of war, but reunited on the altar of peace. On a granite panel is a stylized view of the valiant ram Arkansas in her dash through the Federal fleet in 1862. On July 3, 1863, Generals Grant and Pemberton met under a tree here and discussed surrender terms. Souvenir hunters soon removed all traces of the tree, and a more permanent monument now marks the site. The Louisiana Memorial stands within the Great Redoubt and towers over it. Louisiana was the first southern state to choose a site for a monument in the park. At the top is a flaming brazier carved in granite. The Mississippi Memorial is a 75-foot granite obelisk dedicated in 1909. The highly detailed bronze reliefs were added 3 years later. After the surrender of Vicksburg, Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton found there was no command for his rank. He resigned his commission and served as Lieutenant Colonel of Artillery for the remainder of the war, a fine testimonial to his loyalty to the South. A statue of President Jefferson Davis, a Mississippi resident, commemorates his dedication to the Confederate cause. The tour road passes the visitor center and loops farther south. In 1863, before the siege, the Confederates built Railroad Redoubt to protect the Southern Railroad of Mississippi, a vital access line to Vicksburg. On May 22nd, it was here that Federal General McClernand's men stormed the redoubt and penetrated the Confederate lines. The Texas Memorial now stands where this fighting took place. Farther along is the area where the Great Reunion of 1917 was held, drawing about 8,000 veterans from both sides. The encampment was made up of circus tents because army tents were needed elsewhere during World War I. The reunion was an emotional opportunity for former enemies to meet again on the battlefield, this time as friends and countrymen. The Iowa Memorial stands in sight of the place where troops from that state, under General McClernand, penetrated the Confederate Railroad Redoubt. This monument includes some of the most splendid bronze sculpture to be found anywhere in America. Exquisitely detailed panels depict actions in which Iowans were prominent. At the center is a heroic statue of a color bearer, ready to lead his comrades into battle for their country and their flag. The state of Ohio, instead of erecting a single large memorial, has 37 smaller monuments, each of a different design. They're located all over the park at points where Ohio soldiers saw action. Some depict aspects of Army life, others are symbolic. Even Vicksburg National Military Park itself is in a way symbolic. It's infinitely more than a symbol, of course, but what it represents, as we have seen, is as significant as what it preserves and interprets. Vicksburg had cost a total of about 58,000 casualties on both sides. On July 3, 1863, General Robert E. Lee failed at Gettysburg. The very next day, General Grant's army took possession of Vicksburg. Victory for the Union seemed assured. On Independence Day, 1863, Northerners celebrated the most dramatic 4th of July since 1776. But it was not the end. Brother would still fight brother for nearly 2 more bloody years. Yet the Civil War was a changed conflict after Vicksburg. The Federal victory here was the turning point on the long, tragic, and painful path toward a reunited nation.